Wow, it's hard to ignore the intense debate swirling around this potential ceasefire in Ukraine. I mean,
Mm.
people are talking about it as a possible end to the largest European land war since, World War II. That's a big deal.
Yeah. No, absolutely. It's a moment of huge significance. The implications, for everyone involved, but also just for global stability more broadly are substantial.
Yeah, for sure. And that's really what we're going to try to, dive into today. You sent over this fascinating article. It's called Trump's Ceasefire Push in Ukraine, A Path to Peace or a Strategic Misstep.
Hmm.
It really gets into the nitty gritty of all of this. So, for everyone listening, today we're going to be focusing on President Trump's push for this ceasefire between Ukraine and Russia. Right? We're going to unpack what exactly it is he's proposing, explore the arguments on both sides, and really try to understand the potential fallout. What could happen. It's a lot to process, but we're going to do our best to break it down together.
Right. It's a very complex situation. There's a lot of moving parts, a lot of different agendas at play. And, one thing that immediately jumps out, I think probably for both of us, is Putin's reaction to this whole thing, right? Like he comes out and calls the proposal, quote, great and correct, but then immediately throws in all these additional demands. It's like, huh, that's interesting.
Okay, so let's get into the details then. What is it at its core that Trump's actually proposing here? What does this ceasefire look like?
Well, as the article lays it out, it seems Trump's administration is suggesting a 30-day ceasefire, right?
Uh,
A month where, in theory, the fighting stops. And the key part here is that there's apparently a lot of pressure on President Zelensky to accept these terms.
and then you have Putin seemingly all for it at first glance, but then he drops these, well, let's call them conditions. What exactly is he asking for?
Right, exactly. So like he's saying, yes, but, you
Well,
know. And the buts are pretty substantial. The article highlights some familiar things, Putin calling for more discussions, talking about addressing the root causes of the conflict, which, from Moscow's perspective, usually means pointing the finger at NATO expansion and all that. And then there are these other demands that, well, let's just say they would put Russia in a pretty favorable position.
so not exactly a simple yes then. Sounds more like you said, a strategic maneuver.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to think about it. When you consider everything going on, it's easy to see how Putin's conditions could be a way of buying time.
Yeah.
You know, publicly, he's all for the idea of a ceasefire, but all these conditions basically throw up roadblocks and give Russia more time to maybe advance its own goals.
Right. So let's talk about the major players here. Who are the key people we need to be thinking about and what's motivating them right now? What are their priorities?
Well, obviously, we have to start with Trump, right? The article really emphasizes this sense of urgency on his part. And it seems like there are a few things driving that. There's the uncertainty in the U.S. economy, obviously, and probably this desire for a big, splashy diplomatic win, being the one who brokered peace. He's really framing this as a crucial step toward lasting peace.
Yeah, I mean that makes sense. A major diplomatic victory like that would be, well, huge for him. Okay, so what about Putin? What's his game here?
Well, as we've been talking about, his initial response seems positive, but then he throws in all these, these conditions.
Yeah.
And as the article points out, these could very well be stalling tactics. He talks about NATO, about Ukraine rearming itself. It's all very calculated. It allows him to keep the pressure on while at the same time looking like he's open to de-escalation, like the reasonable one.
And then you have Zelensky who, well, let's just say he's not an easy spot, is he?
No, definitely not. I mean, he's under so much pressure from all sides, as the article makes clear. On the one hand, you have the horrific human cost of this war, hundreds of thousands of casualties. People want it to stop, and he needs to address that. But on the other hand, if he agrees to a ceasefire now, under these circumstances, with Russia in control of so much territory, well, it could mean basically accepting those losses. It's a truly awful dilemma to be in.
Yeah, no kidding. And it's not just them, right? What's the reaction from the rest of the world?
Yeah, good point. The article mentions that there's a lot of skepticism internationally, particularly from those European countries that share a border with Russia. I mean, they have every reason to be wary of Moscow's intentions, right? And they're also nervous about Trump's approach to this whole thing, especially if it looks like he's prioritizing a quick fix over, a truly just and lasting peace. I mean, for them, their own security is the top concern.
Okay, so that gives us a pretty good sense of the lay of the land. Now let's dig into the arguments. Let's start with the people who are actually in favor of this ceasefire. What are their reasons?
Well, the article lays out a few main points.
Yeah.
And the biggest one, I think, the one that resonates most strongly with, just basic human decency. is the idea that a ceasefire could save lives right now. I mean,
Mhm.
after 3 years of this brutal conflict, hundreds of thousands of people dead or injured, a generation traumatized, anything that can stop the violence has to be considered.
Yeah, I mean, that's such an important point. The scale of suffering it's just difficult to even grasp. So the argument is that even a temporary pause, right? Even if it's not perfect, it's better than just letting the killing continue. It gives people a chance to breathe, for aid, to get in, just stop for a second.
Exactly. It would give civilians in these war-torn areas a chance to get some relief, get access to essential aid, things like that. And for soldiers on both sides, it's a chance to regroup, to recover, both physically and mentally. And the article makes a good point. For a lot of people, any ceasefire, even one that's not ideal, is preferable to this endless bloodshed.
Another argument that comes up is that, well, it's becoming increasingly unlikely that Ukraine can actually win this war outright. And so the thinking is maybe it's time to shift gears and focus on diplomacy, try to find a way out of this that doesn't involve endless fighting.
Right. I think that viewpoint recognizes that things are changing on the ground. Ukraine is, struggling to keep up with the demands of this war. Resources are stretched thin, ammunition, manpower, all of it.
Hmm.
And meanwhile, Russia has, adapted, gotten better at defending itself. So from this perspective, a ceasefire is a way to avoid what could turn into a long, drawn-out war that Ukraine might not be able to win. And it might prevent even more territory from being lost.
And the article even brings up historical examples, like the Korean armistice, right? The idea being that sometimes, even when nobody wins outright, a ceasefire can be a first step towards a more lasting peace.
Yeah, that's the hope,
Mm.
that even though neither side can achieve a clear military victory, stopping the fighting can create the space for, real negotiations to happen to try to find a way forward, even if it's messy and difficult.
And then, of course, you have the economic argument. Trump is making the case that this ceasefire is necessary for global stability, that it'll help bring down energy prices and calm the markets.
Yeah, exactly. The argument is that the war is hurting the global economy. Oil prices are high, markets are volatile, and a lot of people believe that de-escalating the situation, having a ceasefire could help address those problems. It could, stabilize supply chains, maybe even open up new economic opportunities with Russia down the line.
Right. And of course, there's the America First angle, which is, well, it's pretty central to Trump's whole approach, right?
Right. Yeah, definitely. And so for people who support this idea, the argument is that, this ceasefire is in line with that America First philosophy. They point out that the U.S. has given a ton of aid to Ukraine, over $75 billion, according to the article. And they argue that maybe those resources could be better used elsewhere, fixing problems here at home. And they see the ceasefire as a way to limit American military involvement in what is ultimately a conflict far away.
And then there's this interesting idea, and I'm curious to get your take on this, that Trump's, let's call it unique relationship with Putin might actually be a good thing in this situation. Like,
Huggle?
it could help him make a deal that nobody else could.
Yeah, it's definitely one of the more, uh, let's say, unconventional arguments being put forward. But the article does bring it up. The idea is that, whatever you think of their personal relationship, Trump and Putin do have this connection. And maybe that could open doors that are closed to, more traditional diplomats. And who knows, maybe Trump's, let's say, unpredictable nature could actually make Russia more willing to compromise in a way they wouldn't with, someone else.
Yeah. I mean, it's a risky bet to make, putting so much faith in personal relationships when the stakes are this high. But but it is an argument that's out there. Okay, so let's switch gears and look at the other side of this. Who are the people opposed to the ceasefire and what are they worried about?
Well, there's a lot of opposition to this, and for good reason. I think the biggest concern, and the one that the article really hammers home, is that this ceasefire could end up rewarding Russia for its aggression.
Yeah, and this goes to the heart of international law and how the world is supposed to work, right? The
Yeah.
idea that you can't just invade another country and then, get to keep whatever land you've taken.
Exactly. The people who are against this ceasefire are saying that, if you stop the fighting now, with Russia still occupying Crimea and big chunks of eastern Ukraine, you're basically telling them it's okay. It sets a really dangerous precedent. It sends the message that military force is the way to get what you want. And that's a huge threat to the idea of national sovereignty.
The article also talks about what it calls Putin's stalling playbook, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, and the point there is that, this isn't the first time Russia's done something like this. You look back at Georgia in 2008, Eastern Ukraine in 2015, and you see this pattern of Russia calling for ceasefires, then using those pauses to, regroup, rearm, and basically get ready for another attack.
Yeah.
So the worry is that all this talk about further negotiations and monitoring, it could just be Putin buying time, solidifying his control, and maybe even preparing for another offensives down the line.
So basically, the fear is that this is all just a show, that it's not about peace at all, but just about giving Russia an advantage.
Right. The concern is that this would let Russia lock in its gains, maybe even come out of it stronger, while at the same time weakening Ukraine, both militarily because the fighting stops, and politically because there's a chance aid could be cut off.
Which leads us to the next point, how this ceasefire could hurt Ukraine in the long run.
Yeah, the critics are saying that, all this pressure on Zelensky to accept a ceasefire, especially if it comes with the threat of reduced military aid, it puts him in a really weak position. It's basically telling him to take whatever deal he can get, even if it's bad for Ukraine. And it could also hurt morale among Ukrainian soldiers, the people who have been fighting so hard to defend their country. It could make them feel like they've been, abandoned. And that makes it even easier for Russia to just dig in and, call the shots.
And then you have the question of how this could damage the U.S.'s relationship with its allies.
Yeah, that's a big one. The article talks about how a lot of European countries, especially those in Eastern Europe, like Poland and the Baltic states, they're very suspicious of Trump's proposal. They're worried that this, rushed ceasefire could break up NATO, which has been the foundation of European security for decades. And they're also concerned that if the U.S. looks like it's, throwing Ukraine under the bus to appease Putin, well, it could embolden other authoritarian regimes around the world.
And finally, there's the issue of Trump's motivations, which, have been clouding from the start.
Yeah, a lot of people are pointing to Trump's past comments and actions as reasons to be skeptical. His praise for Putin, his willingness to make concessions to Russia, the fact that he cut intelligence sharing with Ukraine, his whole thing about wanting Russia back in the G7, all of that raises questions about whether he's really putting America's interests first or whether he's more interested in getting a deal, any deal, even if it's a bad one.
Yeah, it really makes you think, right? There are so many layers to this, strong arguments on both sides. So looking forward, what are the big questions, the things we just don't know yet that will determine how this whole thing plays out?
Well, the article does a good job of pointing out some key factors. First off, what's Putin going to do next? Is he actually serious about this ceasefire, or is he just going to use it to his advantage and then, start fighting again later when he's in a better position?
And can Ukraine hold up under all this pressure?
Yeah, that's a huge question. Can Zelensky and the Ukrainian people withstand the pressure from both sides, from Moscow and maybe even Washington, to accept a deal that might not be in their best interest?
And what about the U.S. and its allies? How's this going to affect their relationship?
Yeah, will this whole thing drive a wedge between them, lead to more mistrust and division? Or, and this might sound strange, could it actually bring them closer together, create a sense of urgency and shared purpose? I mean, the outcome here will have big consequences for global security.
And then you have public opinion in the U.S., which, can't be ignored.
Yeah, absolutely. If people in the U.S. start to feel like the terms of the ceasefire are unfair, or if the fighting starts up again after a brief pause, well, support for staying involved in the conflict could drop pretty quickly.
And then there's the biggest question of all, right? What happens if there is a ceasefire, but none of the underlying issues are actually resolved? What happens if the fighting starts up again a few months down the road?
Yeah, that's the scary part. If the war starts again, but now Russia is in a stronger position, with more territory under its control, and Ukraine may be weakened and demoralized, well, it could be even worse than before. This could turn into one of those frozen conflicts that just flares up every few years, just causing endless suffering. The articles are right when it says the stakes here are incredibly high. This could be, the thing that defines Trump's legacy.
So it all boils down to this, right?
Hmm.
Is this ceasefire a smart gamble, a way to maybe end a horrible war and save lives? Or is it a big mistake, one that lets Putin get away with aggression, weakens Ukraine, and makes the whole world a more dangerous place?
That's the debate, isn't it? The article does a great job of laying out all the different perspectives, all the complexities, and it makes clear that there are no easy answers here. There are good arguments on both sides, and the future is very uncertain.
Yeah, no, it's a lot to think about, and it really makes you wonder What does it even mean to win or lose in this situation? Not just for Ukraine and Russia, but for everyone, for the future of international relations, for the idea that countries shouldn't just go around invading each other. It's something to keep in mind, even after the headlines have moved on to something else.